Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this talk about really what are my cathedral favorites. There are four of them, and I think in the original ad for this, I was thinking it would be five, but there's just not enough time to cover five cathedrals in an hour. So we'll get started and take it from there. I want to say a few things by way of introduction. For those of you who've been with me before, you've heard this before. I'm not here to put myself out as an art historian. I'm not a professional art historian. I'm very interested in cathedrals, both for their history, for their religious history, their cultural history, and the sacred history, the whole idea that people go there to experience the sacred. These are important things to me, and I've tried to learn more about it over time, and it's been a lot of fun to do that. And I'm happy to share some of what I've learned and what strikes me as interesting and favorite with you. I want to give one little disclaimer. Also, I'm not here to proselytize or anything like that. You know, we are in the midst of Holy Week for Christians, and I'll be showing some images that are connected with Holy Week. Really because it is Holy Week, I selected a few that I thought might interest folks who are coming from a Christian background, but I'm not here to promote any particular set of beliefs or any particular denomination. We're going to be looking at two Roman Catholic cathedrals and two Anglican cathedrals. So we're going to visit four cathedrals, two in France, Saint-Denis, which is just outside of Paris, Chartres Cathedral, which is by far my favorite cathedral on earth, and then two in England, Canterbury and Salisbury. Salisbury is the one that really got me interested in Gothic art and architecture when I was an undergrad, and I'll explain a little bit about that when we get to it. So we're heading east, flying first to Paris, and with Saint-Denis right outside Paris, we can take a metro from downtown Paris right out to Saint-Denis. It's a close-in suburb where you'll find that big stadium, the Stadium of France, the Stade de France, where they had the World Cup in 1998, and it's a big deal in terms of soccer in Europe. And then after that, we'll head south and a little west to Chartres, about 60 miles southwest of Paris. So we're starting here at the Basilica Church of Saint-Denis, Saint Denis in English. You see a postcard, which I bought because it's a lot better than the photos I had of the front. And it's the beginnings of Gothic architecture. The four churches that we're looking at here were built between 1140 and 1330. So about a 200-year period. It came at the end of what's called a Romanesque period, when things were a little more round and heavy and walls were thicker. Here at Saint-Denis, you have a few things that are pretty typical of a Gothic cathedral. The start of a rose window. It's very common in French cathedrals, and a three-part front with three portals at the bottom, and you see that they're a little bit still rounded. So this is a transitional building. It lost its tower here on the north in a windstorm in the 1830s, and I read recently that France is actually thinking about restoring that, putting it back up. So the French have got a lot of restoration work going on between Notre Dame and its fire and Saint-Denis and cathedrals really all around the country. Who was or is Saint-Denis, Saint Denis? Well, he is by legend the first bishop of France, the first bishop of Paris, who became bishop of a very small church there in the 3rd century, around 250 or so after Christ. And he was martyred during one of the persecutions. At least that's how the story goes. And the story continues that Saint-Denis was martyred on a hilltop in the north side of Paris that we know today by the name Montmartre. It's where there's a famous basilica made much later. But at any rate, he miraculously carried his head downhill to this a point in the suburb just north of Paris where he died. He was buried there, and later on, that spot became the site of this of a Benedictine abbey. And the guy who founded the abbey is this king, King Dagobert. He died in 639. He founded the abbey in around 600. And it was really a place where monks were learning, living. It was a Benedictine abbey from very early on. And this effigy of King Dagobert was made in the 1200s by King Louis IX, who we know as St. Louis. Our city in the United States is named for him, and many churches are named for St. Louis. It shows a little dream sequence up above in which a bishop appeared to King Dagobert and basically converted him to Christianity. It's shown here that devils are tempting him in a boat, but he's got his hands folded in prayer, and he's going to make it across and not be tempted by those devils. And he converted to Christianity and then eventually founded that abbey. Dagobert was buried in the abbey, and many others then after him. I want to just mention here that this abbey church, one of the reasons it's famous is that it became what folks call a necropolis, a city of the dead for French royals. Many of the kings dating back to Dagobert and some of Charlemagne's sons and family members were buried there. And it went on through the Middle Ages. This effigy or tomb really is one made in the Middle Ages to honor a brother of St. Louis. Tomb of Phillip of France. He died in 1220. And the reason I put it here is to illustrate something pretty sobering. St. Louis's parents, Louis XII and Blanche of Castile, had 13 kids. Only 5 survived to adulthood. It was pretty common in that period of time for children to die very young. Only 5 made it to adulthood. And several of Louis's other brothers and sisters were buried here too. And it went on. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were not buried here. But after the French Revolution, when the monarchy was restored in the 1800s, somebody, and I'm not sure who, if it was Napoleon or one of Napoleon Bonaparte's, one of the other Napoleons or one of the restored kings, made an effigy to Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, who were killed, as you probably well know, during the French Revolution. They died in 1792. And I have this photo here. It's a slide taken when I was there 20 years or so ago. I have it here to illustrate that these churches, these cathedrals are, and what one of my friends, a guy named Rick Legault, who may be on the call with us today, calls time capsules. And they're not just capsules of the time when they were built, but they really do tell a story from when they were built. And this church was actually restored in the 1100s and 1200s. They tell a story from then through current day. The Abbey Church at Saint Denis was badly damaged during the French Revolution. Most of the bones of the kings and queens and their sons and daughters were removed by the revolutionaries because it had that association with the French monarchy. It really became a target of their anger at the French monarchy and its dealings with the rest of society. And Marie Antoinette, with her famous let them eat cake thing, didn't help. So at any rate, a lot of those tombs were basically all of the bones were removed, and some discarded in the rivers, some just thrown away, but there aren't any bones there anymore. Most of the effigies that were there were taken to a museum during the French Revolution and escaped the destruction that way. But other parts of the church were badly damaged. During the French Revolution, the Revolutionary Army, which was basically fighting for the French Republic's survival against the monarchists coming from Austria, Germany, and other places, melted down the roof. They took the lead from the roof, melted it down to make ammunition. The cathedral, the church itself, was used as a storehouse for a while, and then restored when Napoleon Bonaparte came in the 1800s. And he then wanted to restore it and set up his line of family in it with their tombs in order to, in one way or another, associate himself with French monarchy and to show some continuity. So at any rate, it's a really interesting place for all of that, for the history it tells and for what it has survived. But one of the other reasons we're going to look at it is that this is the birthplace of Gothic art and architecture. We're looking down here on the left side, really from where you enter from that plaza that we looked at first, looking down what's called the nave. And we're going to be walking all the way down into what's called the choir. During the monastic days, the monks would have their choir stalls in this part of the church, and they'd sing across from one another and so forth with antiphons. And way in the back, down here on the bottom, there's an apse, the circular eastern end of many French cathedrals. And in that apse is what's called an ambulatory, or a place where the monks would walk around behind the altar and so forth. This is part of their processional area. And this is where Gothic got started, Gothic art and Gothic architecture and so Gothic stained glass. But what happened here is that the architects brought together three elements. They brought together what's called a rib vault, this pointed arch. It brought together pointed arch and vaulting that was ribbed. You see some of the ribs going up here, and what are called lancet or pointed windows. And what it enabled them to do was go higher and open up more of the building to light, to windows. They were able to insert more windows because of those architectural advancements. It enabled them to use, the walls didn't have to be as thick, given all of these architectural developments. And I'm not going to go into all of that stuff, but just know that this is where it got started. Here's an example of a lancet window. It's called a lancet because it has a little pointed top. This is a more modern window. We're going to look at this one, which is a restored 12th century window that shows something called a Jesse tree. And this is a very popular theme in medieval stained glass because it showed the genealogy of Christ pictorially. And it basically has the kings, they're part of Christ's genealogy, moving up to the top, where you see here at the top of the tree, Christ surrounded by 7 doves representing 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. Now, who came up with all of this? Well, here he is on the right. His name is Abbot Suger. Suger was abbot around 1150, between 1100 or so and 1160. And he had the idea that there needed to be light filling these places of worship. And we'll come a little bit more to that. But here he is at the bottom of that window, along with Jesse here on the left. It's called a Jesse tree because it's a prophecy, or at least the Christians view it as a prophecy of the coming of the Messiah, of Jesus. It comes from Isaiah chapter 11, where it says, "And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots." And that branch in Christian theology is Jesus, Mary, Jesus, and Jesse's progeny, who included King David. And here you see this tree, these little circles in the center, and this line going up represent the sap rising in the tree. Jesse is sleeping. This little lamp indicates that it's still pretty early in the evening, during the first watch. But Suger over here on the right is holding a model of this window. So he gets his little moment in the limelight here as people come to see this window and realize, oh, Suger probably had something to do with it, and he did. Suger is recognized as really kind of the father of Gothic art and architecture. He kind of got the ball rolling. When his abbey, that part of the abbey church that was Gothic, was dedicated in 1144, something like 15 bishops from around France, dukes from all around the country showed up for that dedication ceremony. And with the king there kind of giving his blessing, and he funded a lot of it, the idea of that kind of architecture and with more windows really took off. It began in around 1144, and it just took off from there. For many years, it was thought of as French architecture, but it became ultimately called International Gothic because it spread from France to England to Germany and other parts in Europe. And here in the United States, one of the things that really interests me is how some of these things we see in Europe connect to things in the United States. Over here on the left is a statue of Suger, really an homage to him, at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And one of the other really interesting things in Washington, D.C. is that at the National Gallery of Art, they have there Suger's chalice, one of the things that was in the treasury at the Abbey there that was taken during the French Revolution. And we're not sure by whom, but it wound up in an American collection that was donated to the National Gallery of Art. And one of the interesting things about it is that this part of the cup is made of a translucent rock called sardonyx that was gifted to Suger in the 1100s. This part of the cup dates to 200 years before Christ. And down here on the bottom, they added silver with gold overlay to make a base for that chalice. So this was used as a communion cup on special occasions in that abbey, and it's here in the US. The King of France at that time, I remember, was he was a good friend of Suger. Suger and he had gone to school together at the Abbey School. So there was this big, great connection between Suger and the King of France at the time. And one of the reasons that this Abbey church became so famous and was supported so much is that Suger was that king's chancellor when he went off to fight the Second Crusade. So Suger was basically in charge of the French kingdom at that time as a caretaker for 10 years or so while the king was away. And I can't remember his name. I'm so sorry.
I Googled it. I find Dagobert, but that was at the,
way at the front end. Yep. Yeah. So right around 1150 would be the king.
I'll keep looking because I have known it, but I forget right now.
Thank you. Yeah, let us know.
It's Louis
Fill us in.
Mike,
all right. Yes.
This is Mary Lynn. It's Louis VII.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mary Lynn. Louis VII. I appreciate it.
Louis VII.
One of the great things about having Google right there, and everybody was able to look things up while we were talking. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what's the significance of Suger as a statue at the National Cathedral? Is it just to note his style of this cathedral, or what?
The National Cathedral in DC is a neo-Gothic cathedral. It was built starting in the early 1900s and finished around 1992. But it was built at the tail end of what we know now as the Gothic Revival. And we're going to look at a couple images of the National Cathedral in connection with Canterbury coming up in a bit. But it is really to honor Suger's role as the impetus for this style of architecture. So he's honored in DC mainly for his role as an originator of the style. So now we're heading southwest of Paris to Chartres. I usually take the train. It takes about an hour to get there. It's a nice little ride through French countryside that really is mostly wheat fields. It's once you get past Versailles, it's wheat fields between there and Chartres. And wheat fields is what made Chartres kind of famous and to some extent wealthy enough to build a cathedral. Here it is from a plaza. It's on a promontory, I guess I would call it, above the River Eure. And it dates, what you see here dates to the 1100s and 1200s. We'll talk a little bit more about the dating as we look closer. It started out much earlier than that. This is, I think, like the fourth or fifth cathedral building actually built on this site. It had been the site of it's been the site of a church for a long, long time, dating back probably to the 400s or 500s. Little closer look. This is the west facade, and it has a blend of things that I'll point out. Down below here is what's called a royal portal, and we're going to look at one of the doorways here in a little bit. This dates to around 1150, and it's done in an earlier style than what you'll find inside. The towers date up to this level to about the same time. The rose window up above dates to the 1230s, 1240s or so. And this tower on the left dates to the 1500s. So things evolved over time, and Chartres was, the previous cathedral burned in 1194. And at that time, they were able to salvage this part of it, the doorway, this tower, and these windows here, these three lancet windows. And then they added up above it as they rebuilt between 1194 and about 1240. One of the main reasons it's there is to honor Blessed Virgin Mary. It's dedicated to her. It's Our Lady, or Notre Dame de Chartres, Our Lady of Chartres. And it was built in part to house a relic given to the bishop, I think in the 800s or so. A relic that is said to be Mary's tunic, or the garment she wore when she gave birth to Jesus. Christians at the time believed that these relics had a supernatural connection to the saint who is associated with them. Many of the relics are remains of saints, their body parts, their bones, and so forth. Here at Chartres, though, it was a very famous relic in that it was something associated with the Blessed Virgin Mary. And there aren't, as far as I know, a whole lot of her remains in other parts of the world. So this was significant for that reason. And people came to Chartres to be healed by this. They pray here. They felt that there would be a way for the Blessed Virgin Mary at a church dedicated to her like this to really get close enough for her to intercede on their behalf. One of the main reasons for pilgrimages and for the relics was the belief that in the presence of these remains that you could invoke the saint to intercede for you and perhaps do something good for your family, do something good for your health, whatever it might be. In some places, this practice of coming to a place where relics are continues. One in Canada that I've been to, Saint Anne de Beaupré, just a little bit east of Quebec City, dedicated to Saint Anne, and they have her hand there, and people still come to pray to Saint Anne for miracles, and they leave some of the things like crutches and so forth. They leave behind when they feel that Saint Anne has interceded and healed them on their behalf. So a lot of folks were looking for healing in connection with these relics. So that's why they came in the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s. Why do they come now? Well, for a lot of things. Stained glass is one thing, but one of the big things at Chartres that people come for is its labyrinth. It's quite an amazing design right in the floor. They remove the chairs on Fridays, and people come from all over the place to walk the labyrinth. Now, this has become, in modern times, a spiritual practice. This labyrinth has become a model for labyrinths in other churches, including one in San Francisco. Grace Episcopal Cathedral has a labyrinth that's modeled on this one at Chartres. But what did it mean at the time? Well, my friend Rick Legault, who has written about this one, makes a point that this is probably one of those things at Chartres that's really multi-layered in meaning. And it's one of the great things about the art of the time. They weren't just trying to convey one idea through stained glass or sculpture. It might have been two or three things at the same time. So when this labyrinth, and it's not a maze, you actually can go in and walk around, and there's a way in and a way out. There are no dead ends in it. Originally, it had at its center a metal medallion with the Minotaur. This is going back to Greek mythology. The Minotaur grappling, well, Theseus grappling with the Minotaur. And it was symbolic of a hero's journey to come there and back. That idea of a sacred journey, a hero's journey, was kind of taken over, it seems, a little bit by Christianity. And then it became also a way to the cross, that this was a procession of sorts. So it symbolized the way of life that in Christian belief one would follow from where you are now to God. Rick has written a very interesting article about how this labyrinth also has 11 layers to it. It's basically 11 circles kind of going from in to the outside. And that is significant because in the way the folks at this time looked at the cosmos, their whole idea of the universe and how it was organized, looked up to the heavens and saw 11 celestial spheres, that the planets, the suns, and all of this were basically revolving in 11 spheres. So there may be also a reference to their beliefs about the science of the time, what they knew of the universe, all wrapped up in this one big image that is still very popular today. So it's one of the big reasons why people go to Chartres. The other big reason is it's stained glass. Chartres is remarkable in that it's the one place where most of the stained glass created in the 1100s and 1200s has survived. It's not true in England. You find fragments of collections there. It's not true in Germany necessarily. One of the finest Gothic cathedrals there at Cologne has a lot of modern glass, same styles and stuff that you might find here in the United States. But here at Chartres, it survived. So we're looking toward the west at those 3 lancet windows I mentioned earlier and the rose window up above. And we're going to look at a couple little scenes from 2 of them. But let me just tell you a little bit about how this ensemble works. It's basically a summary of what you could find in the cathedral. Over here on the right is a Jesse tree, the prophecy about Jesus coming as a descendant of David, patterned very much on the one that was made at the Abbey Church at Saint-Denis. Here in the middle, the bigger of the 3 windows, is what the French call the Life of Christ window, and it shows scenes from Jesus's birth, the 3 kings coming, and so forth. It goes up to the top, and we're going to look at one of them, the windows there, with Jesus' entry into Jerusalem on the donkey. Over here on the left is Christ's Passion, scenes from Holy Week, and Christ's crucifixion, resurrection. Up at the top are scenes from his appearance to the disciples at Emmaus. And then the rose is Christ in glory, really a scene from the book of Revelation. So sort of the beginning of time, or early time with prophecy, Christ's appearance in the middle, and then Christ coming as judge in the end, all summarizing a little bit of Christian theology in the process. And here's what you might find. One of those little scenes is Jesus on the donkey with people in their palms, laying them down on the ground, disciples in the background, the procession on Palm Sunday. Here, an image from the Gospel of John with Christ, Jesus washing the disciples' feet. The next one we're going to look at is the Last Supper. And this one's interesting in how it tells some of the story. In the Gospel of John, there's a verse that goes, "Now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom," this is from the King James Version, "one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved." Well, the disciple whom Jesus loved, according to tradition, was St. John. He's here leaning on Jesus' bosom. He's usually shown as the beardless one. He's always shown as a younger disciple than the others and shown beardless. The others have beards. Now, the other thing that's going on at this Last Supper, and remember, this is a Passover meal, so usually you would have lamb and unleavened bread and things like that on the table. Well, interestingly, with a little bit of theology here, there's not a lamb in the middle in front of Jesus. There's a fish, a red fish on some kind of a plate. Well, what does the fish refer to? The people in the Middle Ages knew, kind of like that the fish was used early on as an acrostic, because the Greek word ichthys, meaning fish, was used because each of its letters represented a word about Christ. Jesus Christ, or Jesus Christ, Jesus Christus, Theus, I can't pronounce the next one, and then the word for Savior. So it's Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior, all represented in that ichthys image. So here you have Judas about to steal the fish, kind of signaling that Judas was going to betray Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, according to the gospel accounts. So all of these are in those windows. And I'm going to take a quick look back. They read from left to right, typically left to right, bottom to top. They're almost like cartoons. So you could if you didn't read words, and most people were illiterate then, you could read these left to right and top to bottom. Now, one of the other things that's remarkable about Chartres, Cathedral Notre Dame at Chartres, is that a lot of its statuary has survived. Mainly, it survived the French Revolution and various wars. Also, the wars of religion. Many of the cathedrals in France had their statuary in a similar place defaced during defaced, destroyed, whatever, whacked down over the years. So Chartres remarkable in that a lot of it still survives. This is a scene from the right doorway down at the bottom where we were entering in from the west side that shows a number of things. It's a story of Jesus's birth, the nativity down below, moving up. So over here on the left, you have an angel appearing to Mary. That's called the Annunciation. Here, Mary and Elizabeth on the lower level of this lintel in the Visitation. There's a birth scene here with Mary down below and the baby Jesus up above, kind of symbolizing an altar and making another theological point that Jesus would be, in Christian belief, a sacrifice later. Here on the right are the shepherds. There was an angel who used to have a head, now a headless angel right here. Up above, Christ's presentation in the temple, and then going up even further, there's this scene of Mary and the Christ child between two angels that are with their censers blowing fragrant smoke. So there's a sense of holiness to all of this. This image of Mary and Christ child is called a seat of wisdom, Sedis Sapiente. It's an image that's been around a long time. And the people at Chartres, when they designed this, used this as a touchstone to explain a little bit about how they viewed wisdom. And over here in what are called archivolts, you have references or really representations of the 7 liberal arts, which was the summation of wisdom in their day. And the people at Chartres were known for their school where these 7 liberal arts were taught. They did a great job writing about it and conveying the 7 liberal arts to people who came from all over Europe to the school that they had there. So let's just take a look at a couple of these liberal arts. They have allegorical figures of them sculpted into those archivolts around that doorway. And 2 of them are right here. Music on the left, female allegorical figures. This one, she's ringing the bells and she has a stringed instrument here and a zither or something like that here in her lap, but all kinds of musical instruments. Over on the right, grammar, really the first of the liberal arts. It's where the kids started. You have that allegorical figure with a book open. One kid staying awake, quite interested in the lesson. Another one, well, you know, just like school everywhere. One's falling asleep in the back of the room. And the teacher has what's called a ferule. And I think these things kind of started out as plant things, but ultimately ferule became a word for, you know, what most of us in grade school would have thought of was, you know, the whack on the hand with a ruler. It was the Board of Education, so to speak, that teachers would use to keep those kids in line. So he's probably going to be whacked with a ferule pretty darn soon. All right. Now, with my interest in connections between there and here and then and now, a couple things. If you're going around the country, I know that many of us here in Iowa City go east to Chicago, and some of us go a little bit further north to Milwaukee. Jesu Church, here on the left, was designed by a guy who's very much inspired by Chartres Cathedral. And you see the mismatched towers. It's one of the things that the architect thought he needed to convey in a Catholic church. This one's on Marquette University's campus in downtown Milwaukee. over here on the right at Fourth Presbyterian Church in Chicago, in one of their buildings, they have a replica of that labyrinth from Chartres. And they have walks and things like that, and meditations and programs involving the labyrinth. Fourth Presbyterian, some of you may recognize, is the church on the west side of Michigan Avenue, right across from the John Hancock Tower. It's a neo-Gothic church, and one of its side buildings has this labyrinth in it, and you can go in and visit it when we don't have COVID constraints pretty much any time.
The stonework on the cathedrals, were they painted at that time?
They were. They were painted, from what I understand, in quite vivid colors. And one of the things that we may have lost over time when the paint faded away were maybe even some of the things that were written in the books that some of the people held. So at any rate, we'll find, I mean, you could find, if you go to visit some of these cathedrals, particularly in the summer in France, they have light displays. At Amiens Cathedral, a little bit north of Paris, they've had in the past light displays that actually project colors onto the statuary that they believe, gives a pretty good representation or restoration of what the cathedral would have looked like in color, painted in the 1200s, before all of that stuff faded away. In some places, there's still paint fragments, or you see a little bit of it. At Chartres, there's a dragon with a little bit of green paint that you can still see on one of the side porches.
So are most of the materials the cathedrals were made out of from local sources, or did they bring them in from, like Africa for the granite or other things?
In France, most of in Saint Denis and Chartres, most of it comes from limestone quarries that were pretty nearby. The next church we're going to look at, Canterbury, they brought the stone from France across the English Channel. So typically it was brought from the building material itself. There might have been precious stones and things brought from other places, but the building material itself was generally pretty local. So we have a choice here. We're leaving France for England. We can either go by the train under the channel train, or we can take a ferry. Well, I wanted to see the White Cliffs of Dover, so we took the slow route going. And here we have the White Cliffs of Dover and Dover Castle on the top of the hill. And we're going to just take a short train ride inland from there, Dover to Canterbury, about 15 miles or so, and visit Canterbury Cathedral. When I was there with my friend Rick in March 2019, restoration work was way underway. Scaffolding surrounded a lot of the stuff, and we weren't able to really see a whole lot in this part here on the left of the tower called the nave. Mainly, there were big things we wanted to see in terms of stained glass in the back of the cathedral. But I want to just mention a couple things about, I gotta check my notes, just to make sure that I don't miss things. This is the mother church of the Anglican Communion. Canterbury is where we believe Christianity began in England with the arrival of Augustine of Canterbury, a missionary sent by Gregory the Great around in the, I think, late 500s, early 600s. Anyhow, Augustine converted the king and queen, and then things went from there. He gave his land, some of his land, to the monks, who then built an abbey on this site, and that abbey has evolved into Canterbury Cathedral, which we see here today. Canterbury Cathedral is probably best known among us as the scene of a murder, the murder of Thomas Becket, a bishop there. Becket was chancellor to King Henry II, and kind of his right-hand man. And when Henry ran into some problems with the church, he thought that Becket, if he appointed him as Archbishop of Canterbury, would do his bidding. Well, Becket, once in the role, resisted Henry's efforts to not necessarily suppress the church, but to exert his authority over it. Becket pushed back around the whole issue of whether the secular courts would have jurisdiction over priests, and Becket and Henry went head to head on that issue, on the whole question of power, over the church and who's supreme in the land, so to speak. And that, certainly was a controversy that carried on beyond these two men. But Becket left for a while, went into exile in France, came back, and shortly after his return, he and Henry were at it again. And in a Christmas sermon, Becket called out some of Henry's supporters, among other clergy. And by that time, Henry was feeling like he'd had enough and said, who will rid me of this troublesome or turbulent priest? And a few of his henchmen took that literally and murdered Becket in the cathedral. Well, here you have what came of it. They rebuilt the east end of the cathedral in Gothic style and installed Becket's shrine here. And Becket's shrine became the site, even before he was canonized as a saint, a pilgrimage site. People came from all over England and some people from other parts of Europe. This tomb of Becket, and this is a reconstruction, was destroyed in the 1500s by order of King Henry VIII when they dissolved the monasteries in England in the 1500s. So today what you see is a memorial to Becket. This memorial was built in the 1980s on the site where he was killed. And it has 4 swords representing the 4 swords used by the 4 henchmen, the knights, to kill him. 1, 2, 3, 4, and a couple of them have some red paint down on the bottom to indicate the dastardly deed. But one of the things that you have at Canterbury, because of this association with Becket, is a lot of interesting stuff dealing with the pilgrimage. And Chaucer wrote about the pilgrimages to Canterbury and Canterbury Tales, and that came out in 1392. Almost a couple hundred years after Becket's murder, but around the time when the whole pilgrimage thing to Canterbury was really in its heyday. And here are scenes of pilgrims coming in a group, and they usually travel together to avoid brigands on the roads and things like that, for self-defense and so forth. But they traveled in groups and came to Canterbury and stayed for a few days. They came to look for Becket's intercession. And here's a scene from one of the windows there. This is really the ghost of the bishop appearing to heal somebody in bed. He's praying to Becket, and Becket's come to heal him. Now, one of the really interesting things about the stained glass at Canterbury is that there are several of them dedicated to Becket's miracles associated with Becket that were compiled by monks there, basically as the evidence that Becket was or should become a saint. So this is part of his dossier. And they wrote them up, in the late 1100s, early 1200s, before or shortly after Becket's death. And then stained glass artists there used those stories about Becket's miracles to make a bunch of windows. And some of them tell stories of, like a guy who was working in the fields and somebody shot him with an arrow by mistake, and Becket healed him from that wound. Another one tells a story of a nun who had epilepsy, and she came to Becket's tomb, prayed, put her feet in cold water inside the tomb, and was cured of her epilepsy. But one of the more interesting ones, and we're going to look at it here, is the story of Mad Mathilda of Cologne. Mathilda, so the story goes, the legend goes, that she went mad, insane, really into a rage when she learned that her brother had killed her lover. In the process, she killed her child of that lover, born illegitimately, and was distraught and just out of control. So insane, she was appointed guardians, who you see here holding clubs. Mathilda, with a disheveled dress, her hair is, all going wild. Her eyes, if you could see them, are just staring out into the distance blankly. Mathilda was taken by her guardians to Canterbury, and they persuaded her eventually to come to the tomb. And you see these little holes, these red holes, they represent the places where people could put their heads in to get a little bit closer to the saint's relics. Well, in the end, Mathilda here, lying prostrate and praying, is healed. The guardians are relenting, putting down their clubs and thanking God, thanking Becket, and thanking the monk who's standing here for helping to heal Mathilda. Well, what happens after all of that? This isn't just Mathilda, but any pilgrim who comes here to be healed is usually expected to make a little donation. So you see a money bag being emptied onto the tomb, and in some of the scenes, you actually see a little money box there. So contributions were welcomed from way back when at the cathedrals and churches everywhere, and people pitched in once they were feeling thankful for something a saint had done. I'll finish up with a few more slides from Canterbury, and then we'll come back for part 2 with a couple more favorites. One of the things that I wanted to mention, I said earlier that these cathedrals are really time capsules. It's Rick's idea. They tell you a little bit about when they were built, but they also tell you a lot about what's happened since then. And one of the places where you see that is in the stained glass at Canterbury. Here is a Jesse tree fragment. You have 2 panels from the Jesse tree with Josias, one of the kings, who's part of the genealogy, and Santa Maria here on the top. Jesus would have been above. This is all on the left, that's left of that window. During the English Civil War in the 1600s, many of the windows at Canterbury were destroyed by Puritans who felt that these images, including the stained glass and a lot of the sculpture, were papist and therefore unchristian images in their view of Christianity. So England lost a lot of stained glass during the English Civil War. Oliver Cromwell's troops, the parliamentary troops there involved in the Civil War, really took to task many of the buildings, the church buildings that were still associated in their minds with the Church of England and its associations with the Roman Catholic past. So sad episodes. Rick and I, when we were looking around at cathedrals there, saw some really sobering evidence of just the anger, the intolerance, and the misunderstanding about what some of the stuff meant. Over on the other side of the channel during the English Revolution, a lot of kings who were sculpted on the fronts of these cathedrals and other places came down, crashed, broken, destroyed, smashed, because the people who were doing it thought that they were French kings there on the front. They weren't. They were kings from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament kings there, representing this whole idea about the connection between Christ and David in times past. So a lot of ignorance played into the destruction that went on here, which makes it even more disturbing and sad. So at any rate, let's see if I can figure out how to find move my thing forward. I lost my cursor. There we go. And one last thing. One of the fun things I find about these connections between cathedrals, Canterbury and Chartres were both, in their very, very early origins, Celtic communities. The Gauls in France were a Celtic tribe. The Brittani in England were a Celtic tribe, and they were part of this Celtic race that really extended from the British Isles and Ireland way east to Turkey. For those of you who are familiar with the New Testament, Galatians, the root word there is Gaul. There were Gallic people, Celts in Turkey, where St. Paul was a missionary. So at any rate, they were throughout Europe. And some of their imagery seems to have, scholars believe that some of their imagery appears in cathedrals kind of in out of the way places. And this one, these two images appear to be representations of a Celtic god, a fertility god called Cernunnos. He was known to have horns and vegetation coming out of his mouth. So you see that here at Chartres. This was from the cathedral that preceded the one that I showed you earlier. This was from maybe around 1000 or so. And this one is from maybe around 1050 on the left at Canterbury. So that Celtic connection seems to tie these two places together in art that some art historians call marginal art, that's way up high where you can't see it, or it's just in places that it's been taken down, or one thing or another. It's not there anymore. Can you find any of this stuff in the United States? Well, you sometimes will see it in border decorations that are kind of Gothic, but remarkably, in Milwaukee, at a little chapel, Joan of Arc Chapel, which was actually brought from France and reassembled in the United States on Marquette University's campus, there's a little image that I think is Cernunnos in what was once a capital used at the top of a column that was carved out for holy water. That's right there in this little chapel on Marquette's campus. So connections abound, and it's just fun to look for them as you go out to churches and elsewhere. Look for these things. It's fun to see how it all sorts of ties together. So that's it. We'll come back for another favorite and take it from there. Thanks for being with me here today. Michelle, I'll turn it back over to you.